Giovanni Aldini's life and work were inseparable from the legacy of his uncle Luigi Galvani, a man whose accidental discovery would change the course of European science. Galvani, a physician from Bologna, had found in 1780 that frog legs twitched when struck by electrical sparks, a seemingly trivial observation that sparked a storm of interest across Enlightenment-era Europe. This phenomenon, which Galvani termed animal electricity, suggested that electricity was not merely a physical force but perhaps a vital one, the very spark of life. Aldini, born in 1762 and educated at the University of Bologna, quickly became both the torchbearer and the radical reformer of this idea. By the late 1790s, Galvani's theories were under siege by Alessandro Volta, who argued that the electrical effects observed in animal tissue were not intrinsic to the organism, but rather the result of external metal contacts, what he termed contact electricity. Volta's invention of the voltaic pile, the precursor to the modern battery, provided a powerful demonstration of his theory and led to his recognition across Europe. Yet Aldini remained loyal to Galvani's vision. He took his uncle's ideas not as metaphor but as a mandate. If electricity could stimulate dead muscle, perhaps it could also restore life, or at least delay its loss. To pursue this possibility, Aldini immersed himself in the study of both physics and anatomy. He mastered not only the construction of voltaic piles but also the use of metal rods and saline solutions to target nerves and tissues with precision. Unlike Galvani, who was reluctant to stage public spectacles, Aldini understood the value of showmanship. His approach was part science, part theater, and wholly unsettling. He believed that galvanism, the stimulation of nerves with electricity, could be the key not just to understanding life but to controlling it. This belief emerged during a period when the boundaries between life and death were not as rigid as they are today. The Enlightenment had weakened the grip of religious dogma, but science had not yet established firm biochemical definitions for death. A person who had stopped breathing or whose heart had ceased might still be considered revivable by some surgeons or anatomists, particularly if signs of decomposition had not yet set in. Into this ambiguous world stepped Aldini, a man who believed that galvanism could reverse the death process if applied swiftly and forcefully enough. His early experiments were modest by later standards. In Bologna, he applied electricity to the heads of decapitated oxen, watching in fascination as their eyes blinked and tongues lolled. He recorded how facial muscles contorted into expressions of surprise or agony. He even managed to simulate respiration by applying current to the diaphragms of slaughtered animals. Though these trials produced no actual reversals of death, they were enough to earn Aldini a reputation as a boundary breaker. To some, he was a visionary, to others, a ghoul. Napoleon Bonaparte, who was then consolidating power in France, took a personal interest in Aldini's work. The French government granted Aldini a substantial stipend and invited him to conduct further studies in Paris, where scientific innovation was regarded as a tool of national pride. Aldini's move to the French capital marked the beginning of his transformation from academic to scientific celebrity. It was there that he first encountered the idea of using human corpses, fresh from the guillotine, as subjects. The guillotine, introduced during the French Revolution as a more humane method of execution, had the unintended effect of preserving bodies in a highly suitable condition for dissection and experimentation. Executioners were often willing to sell or donate bodies to medical schools in exchange for payment or political favor. Aldini took advantage of this gruesome economy, obtaining decapitated heads to test how far electrical stimulation could go in preserving movement sensation or awareness. In one particularly disturbing demonstration at the École de Médecine, Aldini connected a severed head to a voltaic pile and inserted wires into the trigeminal and facial nerves. Onlookers reportedly gasped as the eyelids opened and shut, the lips trembled, and the mouth twitched into a rictus grin. Some claimed the head attempted to speak, though more skeptical attendees dismissed these claims as projections born of fear and imagination. Still, the effect was undeniable. Aldini had created the illusion of a thinking, feeling entity using only copper, zinc, and human flesh. These early experiments laid the groundwork for what would become Aldini's most infamous act, the galvanic resurrection of a freshly executed man in London. But long before that, his demonstrations in France and Italy had already raised profound ethical and metaphysical questions. Was he merely stimulating dead tissue, or was he toying with the boundary between life and death itself? And if electricity could reanimate a body, however briefly, what did that imply about the soul? For Aldini, these questions were not a barrier but an invitation. He believed that galvanism had therapeutic potential. He published papers arguing that electrical stimulation could treat mental illness, strokes, or even melancholia. Though these claims were speculative, they were grounded in real observations of muscular reaction and nervous stimulation. Aldini envisioned a future where electricity would be a standard part of medical treatment, where madness could be shocked out of the brain and paralysis reversed through electrical pulses. Yet, as he continued his work, Aldini began to draw darker attention. His experiments were increasingly seen as spectacles rather than scientific inquiries, especially among critics who viewed them through a moral or religious lens. Some accused him of hubris, of seeking to play God with forces he did not fully understand. Others, including fellow scientists, questioned the rigor and replicability of his findings. But Aldini pressed forward, believing that only through public exposure and institutional support could his discoveries gain legitimacy. By the dawn of the 19th century, Aldini had refined both his tools and his philosophy. He had moved from animal subjects to human cadavers, and from isolated muscle reactions to coordinated bodily movements. What he now needed was a subject that would provide not just a scientific breakthrough, but a cultural one, a demonstration so vivid and horrifying that no one would ever forget it. That opportunity would soon arrive in the form of a man named George Forster. By the turn of the 19th century, Giovanni Aldini had become more than a researcher. He was a public figure whose reputation straddled the line between scientific celebrity and theatrical provocateur. His experiments had captivated European audiences in academic halls and royal courts alike, but they were also the subject of increasing suspicion. To many, Aldini's work seemed to teeter on the edge of decency, blurring the boundaries between innovation and desecration. Nowhere was this tension more visible than in his public demonstrations, which had grown increasingly elaborate and unsettling. Paris had served as an early stage. There, Aldini arranged for the heads of freshly guillotined criminals to be delivered within minutes of execution, timing his procedures to catch what he believed was a crucial window before the soul, or at least the animating force, had entirely fled the body. In a demonstration that made its way into multiple periodicals, Aldini managed to induce rhythmic blinking and lip contractions in the head of a thief executed at the Place de Grève. Some observers swore they saw fear in the eyes. Others insisted the mouth had tried to speak. Skeptics dismissed the events as mere nerve response, but the psychological effect was undeniable. Vienna followed, and then Prague. In each city, Aldini walked a precarious line. He was both physician and showman, researcher and conjurer. He would enter halls of anatomy with a strange collection of instruments: voltaic piles, copper wires, iron rods, saline-soaked sponges, and a corpse, often barely cold, laid out under flickering candlelight. The air would be dense with the smell of chemicals, heated metal, and death. Aldini performed with clinical precision, narrating his procedures in a calm voice, as the dead body before him twitched, spasmed, or seemed to weep. Not all were amused. In one incident in Milan, Aldini's experiment on the cadaver of a recently executed murderer was interrupted by a priest who stormed into the room and attempted to halt the demonstration, calling it sacrilege against both man and God. The outburst caused a minor riot. The authorities, caught between Enlightenment ideals and traditional piety, ultimately allowed Aldini to continue, but only under heavy supervision. That incident marked the first time Aldini's work became subject to direct censorship, yet these clashes only amplified his fame. His demonstrations drew not just curious students and physicians, but aristocrats, politicians, and even royalty. In Venice, Aldini gave a private performance for a group of Austrian officers using the severed arm of a thief to show how fingers could flex and curl under the right electrical stimulation. One observer fainted, another reportedly vomited, yet the officers applauded, and Aldini left with a new commission to explore the application of galvanism in battlefield medicine. Throughout these travels, Aldini carefully crafted an image for himself, not a mere entertainer, but a man of science, on the frontier of medical revolution. He published pamphlets and gave interviews frequently invoking the idea that electricity was a vital fluid, a missing link between biology and physics. But what truly elevated his notoriety was his decision to take his act to London, a city that combined both a hunger for scientific discovery and a deeply theatrical public culture. England in the early 1800s was a society fascinated with both progress and death. Public executions remained a form of mass entertainment, drawing thousands to Tyburn or Newgate. Anatomy lectures often performed with bodies stolen from graveyards by resurrection men were popular events. In this setting, Aldini's proposal to demonstrate galvanism on a fresh human corpse did not seem entirely out of place, though it was certainly unprecedented in its scale and ambition. The opportunity came in January 1803 with the execution of George Forster. Forster, a 26-year-old man convicted of murdering his wife and child, was sentenced to hang at Newgate Prison. His case had received substantial media attention. The brutality of the crime made him a pariah, and the public appetite for his execution was high. For Aldini, however, Forster was not just a criminal, he was a specimen. Crucially, Aldini arranged with the Royal College of Surgeons to take possession of the body within minutes of death. The goal to apply his refined galvanic methods not to a dismembered body part, but to an intact, freshly executed human being. The demonstration was staged at the Royal College's amphitheater, with dozens of doctors, scholars, and curious members of the public in attendance. The body of Forster, still warm from the gallows, was laid flat on a table. Aldini entered dressed not in theatrical garb, but in a long, dark coat, holding a polished set of electrodes, and an array of voltic piles arranged in series. The procedure was methodical. Aldini began by inserting electrodes into Forster's mouth and ear, causing violent convulsions. The jaw clenched, the eyes opened suddenly, and the face twisted into what one observer called the likeness of rage or agony. Gasps rippled through the audience. When Aldini moved the electrodes to the rectum, a common practice to reach the spinal cord, the entire body arched upward as if the man had been jolted back to life. The most chilling moment came when Aldini stimulated the phrenic nerve and diaphragm. Forster's chest began to rise and fall in a simulation of breathing. This was no longer a dissection, it was a resurrection performance. Some viewers fled the room convinced they had witnessed a soul being pulled back from the void. Others remained transfixed, taking notes or sketching the scene. Newspapers seized on the spectacle, describing it with lurid detail. The Morning Post reported that Forster had been awakened from death, while the Times questioned whether such acts bordered on torture of the dead. A rumor even spread that Aldini had to be stopped from continuing the experiment, for fear that Forster might actually regain consciousness. This was the moment Aldini had worked toward galvanism, once confined to frog legs and cow heads, had now taken center stage in the most powerful city in the world, performed on a man whose crime and punishment had already seized the public's imagination. But while the demonstration solidified Aldini's fame, it also marked the point at which his work began to draw deeper scrutiny, not only from religious and ethical critics, but also from within the scientific establishment. For though the crowd may have been mesmerized, the experiment had not truly revived Forster. The movements were by modern standards predictable motor responses. But in an age without electroencephalograms or reliable criteria for brain death, the line between reflex and resurrection was dangerously thin. The demonstration had not merely blurred scientific boundaries, it had shattered them. Aldini had forced the public to confront a disturbing question: if a man's body could be made to move, breathe, and react after execution, then when exactly did death truly begin? The demonstration at the Royal College of Surgeons did not merely conclude with a surge of electric current. It detonated across London like a psychological bomb. Aldini had proven his point with spectacular brutality. George Forster, executed by the law and pronounced dead by the state, had twitched, gasped, and convulsed under the hands of a man who called himself a scientist. What many had dismissed as a theoretical curiosity was now a visible phenomenon. The dead, if not alive, could still be made to behave as if they were. For days after the experiment, rumors circulated widely through Pamphlet's Tavern, gossip, and sermons. Some claimed that Forster had momentarily regained consciousness before being silenced again. Others swore they had seen tears form in his eyes or lips attempting to form words. While these reports lacked consistency and corroboration, they reflected a deeper public unease. Aldini's experiment had not only reanimated a corpse, it had disturbed the spiritual and social order. If death could be reversed even momentarily, then what did that say about justice? About the finality of execution? About the sanctity of the soul? The reaction was not limited to public gossip. Religious leaders were among the first to respond, and their condemnation was immediate and forceful. Anglican clergy described Aldini's work as necromantic, likening him to a warlock who had defiled a sacred boundary. From pulpits across the city, sermons condemned the use of a human body as a scientific prop. The most strident critics accused Aldini of having stolen Forster's soul a second time once by the gallows, and again by the voltaic pile. In response, Aldini was quick to emphasize that he had operated within the law. Forster's body had been turned over to the Royal College of Surgeons, and Aldini had obtained permission to use it for a scientific demonstration. He had violated no statutes, no public order. Still, he underestimated the strength of cultural and religious sentiment. The line between the law and what society was willing to tolerate had shifted beneath his feet. Perhaps more surprising was the backlash from within the medical and scientific communities. Until that point, Aldini had enjoyed the support of Enlightenment intellectuals who saw Galvanism as a fascinating avenue of exploration. But the spectacle in London had alienated many of them. Some argued that Aldini's methods were more theatrical than scientific. Others were concerned that his public displays threatened to delegitimize the emerging field of experimental physiology, which was struggling to differentiate itself from charlatanism and spectacle. Several members of the Royal Society, while acknowledging the technical execution of the experiment, expressed discomfort at its implications. Letters published in medical journals questioned the ethics of inducing muscle contractions in dead criminals for no therapeutic purpose. They worried that such actions reduced human beings to tools disposable, manipulable, and without dignity. In Parliament, the demonstration even provoked a policy conversation. One member raised the possibility of restricting public access to executed bodies, fearing that such experiments could spark unrest or be seen as a form of posthumous torture. Though no laws were passed directly targeting Aldini, the tone of official discussion shifted. The state might still sanction capital punishment, but it could no longer appear indifferent to the treatment of bodies afterward. Amid this swirl of criticism and fascination, one voice was notably silent: George Forster's. No one in the press, the church, or the scientific elite seemed particularly interested in his biography, his poverty, his motives, or the domestic misery that had preceded his crime. Forster had become a cipher, an object onto which others could project fears or ambitions. In death, he had lost not just his life, but his personhood repurposed as a vessel for scientific display. Aldini, for his part, refused to retreat. He defended his work not only as scientifically valid but morally necessary. In a publication released later that year, he argued that Galvanism could serve humanitarian ends. He suggested that executed criminals whose deaths were already sanctioned by the state could be of great benefit to mankind if used to further scientific understanding. He even proposed that Galvanism might in the future allow for resuscitation of individuals who suffered from accidental drowning or hanging, provided they were reached in time. This was not mere speculation. Aldini had begun compiling accounts of near-death experiences and was increasingly convinced that electricity could restart life in its early stages of failure. But the Forster demonstration also revealed a deeper layer to Aldini's ambitions. Beneath the rhetoric of medical progress was a fascination, some would say obsession, with the spectacle of death disrupted. He didn't just want to heal, he wanted to prove that nature's final decree could be suspended even if briefly. In this way, Aldini's work reflected not just the rationalism of Enlightenment science, but also its limits. The more it explained, the more it stirred unanswerable questions. These tensions reached a peak when Aldini attempted a second demonstration on a female suicide victim whose body had been pulled from the Thames within hours of death. The event was more private than the Forster demonstration, fewer spectators, less publicity, but the results were no less dramatic. According to his own notes, he managed to induce what he called coordinated respiratory action for several minutes, though no heartbeat was restored. When the body convulsed in a way that suggested a scream, one assistant fled the room, visibly shaken. These moments of apparent reanimation were not evidence of life strictly speaking, but in an era without modern criteria for brain death, the distinction remained disturbingly unclear. The public and even the experts lacked the vocabulary to explain what they were witnessing. The result was a strange dual reaction, fascination mixed with horror progress paired with revulsion. It was in this emotional vacuum that Galvanism began to acquire a symbolic weight far greater than its empirical results justified. It came to represent a kind of Promethean daring, the idea that man might steal the secrets of life itself at a terrible cost. This symbolism would soon outpace the science, and Aldini's name would be caught in the crossfire. But in the moment, amid the electrodes and spasming limbs, he stood undeterred. The resistance he faced only deepened his conviction that society was not yet ready to accept what science had to offer. If anything, he believed the Forster experiment had proven the potential of galvanism beyond doubt. He would now turn his attention to applying it not to the dead, but to the living. He would turn from the gallows to the asylum. Aldini's pivot from corpses to the mentally ill marked a decisive and unsettling turn in his career. If galvanism could make the dead twitch and gasp, could it not also be harnessed to cure the living? Particularly those whose ailments were poorly understood, feared and often hidden away. Mental illness in the early 19th century remained a frontier of speculation and abuse. Asylums were overcrowded, their treatments, a mix of herbal tonics, restraints, bloodletting, and neglect. In this environment, Aldini's proposal to use electricity as a therapy was both bold and disturbing. In 1804, Aldini began conducting galvanic experiments on patients at the Santa Maria della Pietà hospital in Milan. His stated aim was to treat melancholia, a term encompassing what today might be diagnosed as severe depression, catatonia, or schizophrenia. His methods were rudimentary, but systematic electrodes applied to the temples, the base of the skull, or along the spine using voltaic piles, adjusted in strength. The early reports were cautiously optimistic. In one case, a mute patient reportedly screamed during stimulation, an act interpreted at the time as a breakthrough. Another patient, long unresponsive, began to speak after several sessions, although incoherently. These results, however, were not accompanied by systematic documentation or follow-up. Most of Aldini's evidence came from anecdotal observation and subjective reports by hospital staff. Critics quickly raised concerns. Was the apparent improvement a response to the shock of pain? Could temporary vocalizations truly be called progress? And above all, were these patients capable of consenting to such treatment? Or were they merely being experimented upon like the dead bodies before them? While Aldini claimed to act in the name of healing, the parallels to his earlier demonstrations were hard to ignore. The same instruments, the same procedures, the same eerie contortions of face and limb. The difference now was that the subjects were alive and in some cases capable of expressing pain or fear. In one especially controversial case, Aldini described applying high-voltage currents to a middle-aged man suffering from what was then labeled mania. The man reportedly reacted with spasmodic movement and crying, then lapsed into silence. Aldini noted this as a favorable calm, but other observers questioned whether the man had instead suffered a neurological breakdown. Still, the idea that galvanism could treat mental illness captured the imagination of some progressive physicians. Aldini's techniques spread to hospitals in Florence, Padua, and even Paris. Some doctors experimented with variations such as immersing patients in saltwater baths while applying current to enhance conductivity. The lack of standardized protocols, however, led to wild inconsistency, and in several cases, severe injury. Patients suffered burn seizures or psychological trauma. At least one death was rumored, though never conclusively linked to the procedure. Aldini, undeterred, continued to proselytize. He published a treatise in 1804 titled Essai théorique et expérimental sur le galvanisme, in which he laid out his belief that electricity was not only a nervous stimulant, but a restorative agent. He cited ancient beliefs about vital forces aligned his ideas with Hippocratic humoral theory, and invoked contemporary breakthroughs in physics to give his work scientific credibility. The book was part manifesto, part medical guide, and part philosophical challenge. Could it be, Aldini asked, that madness was not demonic possession or moral failure, but simply an electrical imbalance? This thesis struck at the heart of two powerful institutions, the church and the judiciary. If mental illness had a physical cause, then centuries of doctrine about sin punishment and moral failure were called into question. Likewise, if the criminally insane were treatable through electricity, then the very premise of retributive justice seemed suddenly unstable. These implications were not lost on the authorities. While Aldini was not censored directly, the climate around his work grew increasingly hostile. Religious leaders warned against the mechanization of the soul. Philosophers balked at the reduction of consciousness to voltage and nerve endings. And as public opinion cooled, so did institutional support. Aldini was denied funding for a larger clinic he hoped to build in Bologna. A planned lecture tour through Austria was quietly cancelled. A position at a French medical academy was awarded to a rival who had publicly dismissed Aldini's methods as modern witchcraft clothed in wires. Yet not all resistance came from elites. Common people, too, began to grow wary. In towns where Aldini had previously been welcomed, rumors now circulated that his treatments could cause madness rather than cure it. In one disturbing account from Ferrara, a mother reportedly removed her son from a hospital upon learning that the lightning doctor was coming. She claimed that the last man Aldini touched spoke like the devil for 3 days and never walked again. These reactions reflected a broader shift. Aldini was no longer perceived simply as a scientist pushing boundaries, but as someone who had crossed into morally treacherous territory. The public, once entertained by galvanic twitching and spectacle, began to recoil as the implications deepened. What had been a display of scientific wonder now felt invasive, even predatory. There were also personal costs. Aldini's health began to decline, possibly due to overexposure to the electrical currents he frequently tested on himself. He had taken to self-experimentation in an effort to prove the safety and efficacy of his techniques. These experiments, often conducted late at night in private laboratories, became more intense and more erratic. In one of his own journals, he described experiencing a rupture in vision, like the eye itself flickering, which may have been an early sign of retinal damage. His writings during this period took on a more desperate tone. Gone was the confident theorist of earlier treatises. In his letters to colleagues, Aldini wrote of being misunderstood, of facing institutional cowardice, and of a society too frightened to accept that the soul may have a circuit. He appealed to logic to progress to reason, but his words now bore the edge of isolation. Once lauded by Napoleon and celebrated across Europe, Aldini was increasingly alone both professionally and intellectually, and yet his work did not go unnoticed. Even as his star waned, others were quietly taking note. Philosophers, poets, and writers intrigued by the eerie interplay of death and animation, of science and transgression. Among these observers was a young woman named Mary Shelley, whose imagination would soon absorb the implications of Aldini's experiments in a way even he could not have foreseen. Before long, Aldini's galvanism would leave the laboratory entirely and enter the realm of myth. By the mid-1810s, Aldini's public career had entered a twilight phase. While his earlier demonstrations had drawn crowds and notoriety, his recent work with the mentally ill had provoked suspicion and even hostility. Nonetheless, the shockwaves of his galvanic experiments continued to ripple through Europe, not only in medical circles but in the broader culture. And it was in this climate of post-Enlightenment anxiety, where science seemed poised to overtake old spiritual certainties, that Aldini's legacy found an unlikely second life. In 1816, during an unusually cold and bleak summer by Lake Geneva, a circle of writers gathered at Villa Diodati, including the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, his lover Mary Godwin, and the infamous Lord Byron. It was here during their nighttime storytelling competitions that Mary Shelley conceived what would become Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. The novel would not be published until 1818, but its roots were fertilized in the very soil Aldini had spent years cultivating. The idea that electricity could disturb the boundary between life and death. Mary Shelley's exposure to Galvanism was not incidental. She had grown up in a household steeped in radical thought. Her father, William Godwin, a political philosopher, her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, a pioneering feminist thinker. Both had supported Enlightenment ideals, but were wary of the excesses they could engender. Shelley absorbed this dual perspective. She was fascinated by progress, but terrified by its potential to unmoor society from morality, tradition, and even sanity. Aldini and those like him embodied this ambivalence. She would have known through Percy and his medical associates of Aldini's galvanic experiments, especially the sensational account of George Forster's twitching, gasping corpse. Shelley transformed these scientific procedures into myth. In Frankenstein, the doctor who dares to reanimate dead tissue is not portrayed as a triumphant visionary, but as a man whose brilliance is eclipsed by his inability to foresee the consequences. Victor Frankenstein's monster is a patchwork of flesh and ambition, a grotesque mirror of Aldini's real-life endeavors. The novel quickly gained traction, particularly among readers disturbed by the rapid acceleration of science in the early 19th century. While Shelley never named Aldini directly contemporary reviews, and private letters often referenced his work in relation to the story, Galvanism, once a fringe idea confined to lecture halls and morgues, had now become a literary metaphor for scientific hubris. Aldini had not created a monster, but he had made one imaginable. This transformation of a scientific technique into a cultural symbol was both a triumph and a tragedy for Aldini. On one hand, his ideas had broken free from the lab capturing the public imagination. On the other, they were now distorted, reframed through fear rather than promise. Where Aldini had seen medical potential and therapeutic applications, the world increasingly saw danger, arrogance, and unnatural interference. And it wasn't just in literature that his influence could be traced. Philosophers like Schopenhauer and physicians in the growing field of psychiatry began referencing galvanism not as a viable treatment, but as a cautionary tale of materialism gone too far. The idea that the human being could be understood as circuitry and tissue rather than soul and spirit struck many as a violent affront to centuries of moral philosophy. This reaction had real consequences. By the 1820s, the study of galvanism was gradually folded into broader investigations of bioelectricity, but stripped of Aldini's theatricality and ethical provocations. Researchers like Carlo Matteucci and Émile Dubois-Reymond would continue studying nerve conduction and electrical impulse, but with a far more clinical and morally detached approach. The flamboyant speculative flavor that had characterized Aldini's work was now seen as a liability, a phase that science had outgrown. The universities that had once hosted his lectures now kept his name at arm's length. His treatises remained in circulation, but were cited cautiously, often with qualifiers like controversial or outmoded. Some colleagues quietly distanced themselves. Institutions that had once celebrated his ingenuity now preferred to emphasize methodological rigor over bold experimentation. A new generation of researchers shaped by stricter definitions of empirical evidence no longer saw Aldini as a pioneer, but as a relic of a more chaotic transitional era. And yet in private, Aldini continued to write. His notebooks from these years, still preserved in fragmented form, reveal a man struggling to reconcile the gulf between what he had achieved and what he had hoped to achieve. He lamented that galvanism had become a horror tale, and that the public no longer trusted the hand that reached beyond the veil. He also expressed concern that the scientific community had become too conservative, too afraid of controversy, to pursue breakthroughs that might upset moral comfort zones. One entry from 1821 is particularly revealing. Aldini wrote, "They speak of me in fiction, but not in fact. The dead still move. The mind still hides behind the veil of the skull. But they do not come to see." His writings turned increasingly inward, occasionally lapsing into poetic fragments. These musings were not confessions nor defenses, but rather reflections of a man who had once held the public eye, and now wrestled with the obscurity of legacy. He did not regret his choices, but he recognized their cost. Ironically, it was the continued rise of Frankenstein as a cultural icon that kept Aldini's name in circulation. Though often reduced to a footnote or a trivia item, the real-life scientist behind Frankenstein, his work remained embedded in the origin story of bioethics, the moral philosophy of science, and even the development of psychological treatments. Every modern conversation about consent dignity and the boundaries of experimentation had in some quiet way passed through the shadow of Giovanni Aldini. He had not written the rules, but he had forced the world to ask whether there should be any. As Giovanni Aldini's influence waned in scientific circles, he began to redirect his energy into public engagement and policy. If he could no longer dazzle the academic world, he would at least leave a mark on its institutions. In 1823, he published a lesser-known work titled Mémoire sur les moyens de secourir promptement les asphyxiés, a guide for rescuing victims of drowning and suffocation using galvanic stimulation. The text, though dry in tone, was aimed not at scientists, but at city officials and fire brigades. Aldini had pivoted once again from healer of madness to restorer of life, if only in its earliest moments of cessation. He made a practical proposal, establish galvanic rescue stations in major European cities equipped with portable voltaic piles and trained personnel. The vision was strikingly modern, a network of public emergency responders using electrical equipment to revive those who had stopped breathing or suffered cardiac arrest. In today's terms, it was a precursor to the defibrillator. At the time, it was considered fantastical, bordering on eccentricity. Still, Aldini found limited support. In Paris and Milan city councils entertained the idea, if only to appease a man whose fame still carried weight in political circles. A single prototype galvanic station was reportedly constructed in Bologna, near a river crossing known for accidents. Staffed by medical students, it featured insulated tables, copper wire spools, and a small collection of voltaic cells. The station saw minimal use and no documented success stories emerged, but the concept, the very idea that death could be interrupted by a correctly applied current, persisted. Behind these efforts lay a deeper fixation. Aldini remained convinced that the boundary between life and death was not binary but elastic. He believed the real tragedy was not death itself, but society's failure to act swiftly and scientifically in the moments immediately after trauma. His pamphlets urged civic leaders to think of drowning, hanging, or gas asphyxiation not as fatal conditions, but as potentially reversible states if electricity were applied within minutes. Yet the more Aldini argued for urgency, the more he seemed to slip into desperation. His tone shifted from reasoned appeal to impassioned insistence. He began citing anecdotal cases where spontaneous resurrections had occurred. A boy revived after falling into the Seine, a miner found breathing hours after being presumed dead from fumes. In these stories, Aldini saw evidence of what he had always believed, that death, particularly from non-traumatic causes, could sometimes be stalled or reversed by galvanic means. Critics saw something else: a man unable to let go of a fading dream. Some contemporaries described Aldini's obsession as a kind of madness itself, a cruel irony given his experiments on the mentally ill. Letters from former colleagues grew terse, deferential, but distant. Younger scientists, now trained under more rigorous empirical models, avoided association with his name in formal papers. In some academic circles, Aldini became shorthand for reckless experimentation, a warning rather than a model. Still, his reputation wasn't entirely extinguished. He was invited in 1825 to deliver a guest lecture at the University of Pavia on the history of galvanism. The audience was respectful if subdued. When he attempted to demonstrate a new miniaturized version of the voltaic pile, the device failed to spark. He carried on regardless, narrating his journey from the courts of Napoleon to the asylum wards of Milan, from the twitching limbs of oxen to the gaping mouth of George Forster. It was in Pavia that Aldini finally acknowledged what he had never previously admitted in writing, that none of his procedures had truly restored life. They had mimicked it, perhaps even prolonged the moment of death's onset, but never reversed it. We saw movement, but not mind, he said. Function, but not return. These were not the words of a man renouncing his beliefs, but rather of one accepting their limitations. Despite this public humility, Aldini remained undeterred in private. In the final years of his life, he returned to Bologna and resumed his solitary work. Visitors to his home described a study filled with antique medical texts, wires coiled like snakes, and a locked cabinet containing remnants of old voltaic piles. His journals from this period are sparse, but one entry stands out. It is not death that resists, it is ignorance. One day they will build machines that do what I have tried with trembling hands. As his health deteriorated, Aldini became increasingly reclusive. Some accounts suggest that he suffered from neurological issues, possibly caused by decades of exposure to electric current or corrosive metals used in his experiments. Others described signs of cognitive decline. Whatever the cause, Aldini died in 1834 at the age of 72, quietly and without ceremony. There were no large obituaries, no public mourning. His passing was noted in medical bulletins, often in a single paragraph, summarizing his work with galvanism and nervous stimulation. Yet death did not grant him peace and memory. In the years that followed, Aldini's legacy was fragmented. To some, he remained a visionary, the man who dared to touch the border between life and death. To others, he was a warning about the dangers of unbounded science. And to many more, he was simply forgotten, overshadowed by the myth his work helped inspire. Still, echoes of Aldini surfaced in strange places. In 1836, 2 years after his death, a rural French coroner reportedly attempted to revive a drowned child using a battery based on Aldini's early designs. The child was not saved, but the story circulated in newspapers. In England, a young physician named John Snow, later famous for discovering cholera's spread through water, referenced Galvanism in a footnote discussing the renewal of suspended animation. And in literature, Aldini lived on. New editions of Frankenstein began to appear with prefaces referencing real scientific efforts to reanimate the dead. Aldini's name crept into Gothic novels, pamphlets, and penny dreadfuls, often distorted, sometimes villainized, but never truly erased. He had failed in his central aim, but in failing so spectacularly, he had changed the discourse itself. Even as Giovanni Aldini's name faded from the medical journals of Europe, his cultural afterlife only deepened. In ways he could not have foreseen and likely would not have welcomed, his experiments became archetypes of scientific transgression, feeding the 19th century's growing ambivalence toward industrial modernity. The Enlightenment had promised mastery over nature through reason and experiment. But Aldini's work, particularly his demonstrations on George Forster and mentally ill patients, revealed a more disturbing possibility that scientific mastery could strip life of its dignity and blur the line between healing and violation. The figure of the Galvanist, once seen as a daring medical pioneer, now became a stock villain in literature and popular imagination. Novels, stage plays, and later even early films would depict deranged doctors shocking corpses back to life, with lightning crackling in the background and monstrous consequences. While Mary Shelley's Frankenstein had introduced the theme in literary form, its imitators exaggerated the horror and minimized the nuance. Aldini's meticulous methodology was replaced by crude stereotypes: the mad scientist with wild hair, the lab assistant dragging in bodies, the electrodes sparking in the night. This transformation coincided with the rise of Romanticism, a movement that distrusted Enlightenment rationality and emphasized emotion nature and the sublime. For Romantics, Aldini was not a Prometheus but a cautionary tale, a man who had tried to conquer nature and succeeded only in horrifying the world. In their eyes, his electrodes and voltaic piles were not tools of progress but symbols of hubris. Artists depicted galvanic experiments with Gothic shadows, swirling smoke, and anguished figures caught between death and unwanted life. Meanwhile, in medical institutions, the ghost of Aldini lingered awkwardly. His early galvanic techniques had fallen out of favor, but they laid groundwork for future advances in neurology and electrophysiology. The idea that electricity could influence muscle contraction, nerve conduction, and even brain activity would eventually lead to technologies like the electroencephalogram, EEG, and electroconvulsive therapy, ECT. Yet these innovations were often framed as entirely new, with only passing reference to their messy theatrical predecessor. Still, Aldini's name continued to surface at odd intervals. In 1849, German physician Émile Dubois-Reymond publicly acknowledged Aldini's role in inspiring research into bioelectricity, even while distancing himself from the public spectacles that had discredited galvanism. Later in the 1860s, English neurologist John Hewlings Jackson cited early galvanic experiments in his discussions of epilepsy and nervous response. These were polite technical references, nods to a controversial ancestor, not full endorsements. Outside of medicine, Aldini's legacy took on new dimensions. By the late 19th century, spiritualists and occultists had seized upon galvanism as a tool of the uncanny. Seance leaders claimed that galvanic devices could help communicate with the dead or detect spectral presences. Pseudoscientific journals published lurid accounts of spirit currents and electrical souls, often citing Aldini by name or an implication as the originator of these techniques. What had begun as rigorous anatomical experimentation was now steeped in mysticism. Aldini might have recoiled at such associations. Despite the dark theatricality of his experiments, he had always considered himself a man of the Enlightenment. He believed in evidence repeatability and the betterment of society. That his work should be repurposed by charlatans and spiritualists would have been an insult, yet also perhaps a bitter irony. In trying to reveal the mechanics of life and death, he had opened a door others would not close. That door remained ajar as the world entered the 20th century. New ethical frameworks for human experimentation began to emerge, spurred by both the promise and the horrors of modern medicine. The idea of informed consent, the distinction between therapeutic and non-therapeutic procedures, and the role of public oversight all had roots in the kinds of questions Aldini's work had raised. His use of executed criminals, his treatment of asylum patients, his public demonstrations. All these were scrutinized in retrospect as the field of medical ethics matured. In this sense, Aldini's legacy is paradoxical. He is remembered less for the scientific validity of his experiments, which were ultimately eclipsed by more controlled methodologies, and more for the ethical and philosophical crises they provoked. He forced a generation to ask what science was allowed to do with the dead, the mad, and the powerless. These questions still echo in today's debates about brain death organ harvesting and neural implants. Meanwhile, in the world of fiction, Aldini's shadow stretched further still. By the early 1900s, the figure of Dr. Frankenstein had entered mass culture, appearing in stage adaptations, penny novels, and eventually cinema. The 1931 film adaptation by Universal Pictures, starring Boris Karloff, cemented the image of the reanimator wielding arcs of electricity. Although the film made no explicit reference to Aldini, his fingerprints were everywhere in the electrode-studded tables, the body convulsions, the moral ambiguity. Ironically, as Aldini faded from textbooks, he became immortal in horror. Even today, Halloween costumes, comic books, and video games echo his experiments, often without knowledge of the man behind the myth. He had tried to animate corpses. Now his own name was reanimated in cultural memory, distorted theatrical but stubbornly persistent. In academic circles, there have been periodic attempts to reclaim Aldini's legacy as something more than a sideshow. Historians of science have pointed out that despite the grotesque nature of his experiments, Aldini's methods were structured, repeatable, and grounded in the best knowledge of his time. He recorded data, meticulously followed anatomical logic, and believed, however naively, that his work might improve lives. His descent into public spectacle was not proof of charlatanism, but of a society unprepared to face the implications of its own science. In this light, Aldini appears not as a villain or hero, but as a mirror reflecting the hopes and anxieties of a culture poised between the old world and the new. He did not create monsters, but he helped expose the monstrous potential of progress, unchecked by ethics. It is this complexity that ensures his story will continue to haunt the intersection of medicine, morality, and myth. The dead may not walk, but the questions Aldini raised about them still do. In the final reckoning of Giovanni Aldini's life and work, the man who once electrified corpses on public tables had become an obscure figure. His name, largely erased from the institutional memory of modern science, persisted only in fragments scattered across footnotes, misremembered anecdotes, and the twisted fiction he helped inspire. Yet even in absence, Aldini remained present, embedded in the deeper philosophical architecture of how modernity defines life, death, and dignity. Aldini's greatest challenge had never been technical, it was conceptual. He attempted to apply scientific logic to domains that had been the territory of theology and morality for millennia. In doing so, he destabilized core assumptions about the body and the soul. Was life a divine gift or a physical phenomenon? Could the cessation of breath be reversed if the right current was applied in time? And if so, did death still mean the same thing? For Aldini, the answer had always been mechanical. He had witnessed the sparks of movement, the artificial respiration, the shudder of muscles forced to remember their function. But for society, these moments were less convincing than they were disturbing. Reanimation did not comfort, it provoked. It made visible the mechanisms of life, and in doing so stripped them of their mystery. This discomfort only deepened as Aldini moved from corpses to the living, targeting the insane, the poor and the condemned, those already marginalized, made more vulnerable by the belief that science could override their will in the name of progress. The rise of medical ethics in the late 19th and 20th centuries would implicitly respond to these excesses. The need for consent, dignity, and transparency, all hallmarks of contemporary biomedical practice, emerged as answers to the very violations Aldini's work had made impossible to ignore. While he may not have intended harm, the ambiguity of his legacy forced later generations to articulate precisely what science should not do. In this way, Aldini functioned as both progenitor and foil. Strangely, as science advanced, many of Aldini's instincts were vindicated, though stripped of their spectacle. Electrical defibrillation, first demonstrated in dogs in the late 1800s and later applied to humans in the 20th century, would become a cornerstone of emergency medicine. Deep brain stimulation, now used for treating Parkinson's disease and depression, applies targeted electrical pulses to alter behavior and cognition. Electroconvulsive therapy, while controversial, remains a regulated psychiatric intervention. Each of these therapies rests on a foundational premise Aldini had first acted upon, that electricity can modulate the nervous system. But in contrast to his unregulated experiments, these modern practices are institutionalized, peer-reviewed, and crucially subject to ethical scrutiny. The same voltages that once made corpses sit upright in crowded lecture halls now pulse through hospital devices under strict oversight. The tools remain, but the framing has changed entirely. This divergence between raw discovery and its domesticated form is at the heart of Aldini's tragic relevance. He did not live to see his visions refined, nor to receive credit for his foundational role. But the echoes of his work persist in each machine that jolts a heart back to rhythm, in each electrode that maps the firing patterns of the brain. And yet his most enduring afterlife is cultural. The archetype he helped conjure, the electrifying scientist, the meddler, in life's forbidden processes, has proven far more immortal than the science itself. Whether in the pages of Gothic novels or the silver glow of cinema, Aldini's silhouette remains visible behind each lightning bolt that animates a monster, each tragic figure who plays God and pays the price. His real tragedy was not failure, but misinterpretation. Aldini sought to extend life and relieve suffering, but his most famous experiment, conducted on the body of a hanged man in a crowded London theater, became a grotesque parable of overreach. What he had meant as demonstration was received as desecration. The scientist's hands were steady, but the audience's gaze transformed them into claws. And so Giovanni Aldini, the man who once stood at the threshold between the Enlightenment and the Gothic, between the morgue and the asylum, now exists somewhere in between. Part scientist, part symbol, forever animating the dark dreams of progress. In the end, Giovanni Aldini's story is not one of monsters or miracles, but of questions. Uncomfortable, lingering questions about where life ends and where it might begin again. His experiments, situated at the raw edge of science and society, forced the 19th century to confront its own uncertainty about death dignity and the power of human intervention. He did not succeed in reversing death, but he succeeded in making death visible material, manipulable, and disturbingly incomplete. Long before ventilators and resuscitation protocols, Aldini imagined a world where electricity could rescue those on the brink, where breath and heartbeat were not fixed endpoints but variables. He asked the world to reconsider its assumptions. And when the world recoiled, it was not because he had failed to reveal something, it was because he had revealed too much. Today, Aldini's name is rarely spoken outside academic niches or trivia segments on Frankenstein, but his fingerprints are everywhere in the whirring of hospital machines, in the quiet hum of electrodes, and in the ethics that now guide their use. The lines he blurred have since been redrawn more cautiously, more humanely, but not without cost and never without memory. His legacy endures not because he solved the mystery of life, but because he refused to accept its finality without a fight. And in that refusal, he became something more than a scientist. He became a warning, a legend, and a mirror reflecting what it means to pursue knowledge without knowing where the path ends.